Okay, this is the fixing of my sand reapers, rear suspension, and kind of an idea of what you do to maintain them. I do some of this on a regular basis. I have a video out of me doing some pretty heavy duty mudding out in my front yard. This is what entails after you're done mudding, at least if you want it to last very long. My main problem that I have right now is my CV joint inboard went out, called a tripod. CV joint. And what it is you have your cup, your CV joint fits in here with a couple bearings, 3 bearings, and what I did is lost all my needle bearings that would go inside this. Normally, this is what most cars have for inside joints. They're very strong. Indy cars and formula cars also use the same kind of joints. And that fits inside there. This fits on the shaft. It fits on the axle. And each one of these would have needle bearings, and the whole assembly would go together and you would have a boot. For whatever reason, my needle bearings worn out. It was still operational. I mostly determined it because I was getting clunky noise, and I noticed that I was getting high temperatures. I use an infrared temperature gun to check all my joints, and this one started heating up and getting a little extra warm. So I found out that ended up being the problem. So I had to order a new axle shaft. There are no parts available for that, and you cannot get them anywhere except through Sand Reaper. This is the entire axle. This would normally fit on here with the joint, and the whole thing would fit up underneath there. I have my new axle in place already. Now, let's get this out of the way. Regular maintenance on the suspension is, the whole suspension system mounts to a couple A-arms, upper and lower A-arm, and where your caliper assembly and wheel bearing assembly mount is all put together with steel collars and Teflon bushings that would fit together like so inside the I've already taken these all apart and cleaned them. You'll find, might be hard to see, inside here there's little ridges, 3 little slits in here that let the grease, as you grease this through the greaser, let the grease push out and make sure that your collar where it rides inside there will be greased and able to pivot like that. One thing you'll find is that when you grease these collars go from end to end and are bolted pretty tight. There's no way for grease to get inside this collar. So as you take this apart and clean it, you'll want to take your mounting bolt, grease it heavily, and slide it inside there and grease the inside of your collar so that won't rust up. You'll find that that can happen running through a lot of mud, water, and bad conditions like that. The other thing I did is on your lower greasers, you'll see on these are straight coming up. The lower A-arm also comes from the factory with straight up greasers. When your whole assembly for your rear wheel is mounted in place with your caliper and everything in place, you'll find that it is almost impossible to get a grease gun straight down to these greasers. What I've done is put 90s on the lower ones. They're 5.5 millimeter, and use some red thread lock. And so it locks them in place because they may not tighten up exactly in the location where you want them to be able to grease them easily. So I've already updated all mine with a 90-degree grease zerks, and just leave the straight ones on the top because they're real easy to get to. You also have 4 grease zerks on each one of your pivot points on the inside. Now, probably what I should have done on this time, I'm not going to. I'll do it later in the year or in the winter when I'm not doing it, is these collars all need to be taken apart and cleaned and re-lubed and everything else. Okay, so that's pretty much what suspension is. Pretty simple. You have your shock, your adjustable shock. It's a gas charged shock. And another thing that you will find you will periodically need to do I had this happen with me. This is the same thing, and most of this is pretty simple. If you own a Jeep, Ranger, whatever, anything you take in a mud, you need to do things to maintain it. Now, if you know anything about cars, or this is the rotor and the brake assembly, and you'll find that the calipers slides, they move pretty good here now. You'll find that on this over time. These will rust up or get hot from using your brakes, and the grease will melt out of them. So periodically, just like you would on a car or four-wheel drive or any other truck, is you need to take these apart and clean these periodically and re-grease them to make sure your slides will continue to move. It's pretty easy to do. As far as to diagnose, what I do is if I can reach in the back and shake my caliper, when it's just sitting in a neutral state, I can see if those are moving. If I can't, then I know they've probably locked up and I need to clean those. You'll find, depending on how you're doing it, you'll need to clean those caliper slides a couple times a year. Same with the suspension. I do this a couple times a year. If I do some deep water running or heavy duty mudding, then this is part of the cleanup. You wash the whole thing, clean everything out, and then tear your suspension down. You can leave the dirt in there. It's just going to wear all the parts out that much quicker. Now, as far as putting this whole thing together, it's pretty simple. You just have your axle shaft that goes through here with a spline. You'll find you can just put this together like this. If I can hold it, axle shaft goes in the middle. Get the bottom started in there. Axle shaft started in. Slide the bolts through the bushing, through the lower suspension. And the bushing pops out. If the axle shaft slid up on there, you can just bring the upper suspension down, put that in place, slide your upper suspension bolt through, and that goes into place. I prefer to have them go this way. When they come from the factory, they're bolted through this way. I suppose that doesn't really much matter. You might get a little more dirt and threads. It gives me, I like it this way. You can look at it, see it, inspect it. One thing you might find are the bolts that come from the factory are a lock bolt, but they don't seem to lock that tight. I did have one of these nuts vibrate off, and the whole bolt started to come out. Luckily, I found it in time. But as far as putting everything together, that's pretty simple. You can just put your bolts back on, your nuts, upper and lower. And you'll see, pretty simple. Line up the slides. Now before, I'll show you how everything goes together. Before I tighten it down, I'd have to take the brake pads, and they're basically just like any automotive disc brake setup. You also have your large locking nut for your axle. Is that slide your axle through. And that gets tightened down. I'm not exactly sure what the torque specs are on that. What I do is I just torque that to roughly about 5 to 7 foot-pounds, because you don't want to crush that bearing too much. You put a cotter pin through there to ensure that it's locked. Basically, once you get it all together, you want to make sure you don't have any slop within your bearing. Caliper, just an automotive caliper type. You'll find that, and you're in the mudding situation, you'll get a lot of mud packed around your seals and inside your caliper cup. You'll want to periodically clean that, get all that mud out of those seals. You don't want to damage your seals. And as far as going on, just slides on like any automotive style caliper. Pretty simple to do. Put in the bottom bolt, and that's pretty much all there is to maintaining this. So if you need to do this periodically after mudding or different situations of how you're running, you basically just take your caliper off, take your pads out. You can take your bolt off your axle, take your whole assembly off after you take off your 2 pivot bolts, and that lets you access your whole suspension. And make sure that when you jack it up, obviously you want to use a jack stand and do things in a safe manner. It's pretty simple to do. I mean, you're going to spend a couple hours doing it, but you're going to maintain it, and you're going to make the machine last a lot longer. I mean, a lot of people sit here and say, oh, these things are a piece of junk, they wear out, things break. Obviously, if you run them hard and you're doing that kind of mudding, things are going to break. Or you can maintain things before they get to the point of breaking, and that's part of it. You have to maintain your suspension. You can do this on the front suspension pretty much the same way. On there, you have upper and lower ball joints. You can't really take those apart and clean them. I haven't had any problem with my ball joints, but you can take the whole A-arms off and clean your inside pivot bolts and do the same thing. Pretty simple system, but it works really well. It's unequal length, so keeps everything as it goes through its travel, keeps the wheel, stops it from angling in or out, and that's pretty much all there is to it. So hope you get an idea of what it takes to work on your sand reaper and the rear suspension, and you can pretty much carry this along to the front suspension and it'll work exactly the same. Now, one point that I did make about the 90-degree zerks on the bottom is you have to think of how your wheel assembly is here, and once you get that wheel on here, you get that on here, it makes it almost impossible to get to these lower zerks when they're straight. You just can't get a grease gun in at that angle and effectively do it. So that's why I put these 90-degree zerks on here. So you can just get your grease gun in, and you can see as you're doing it, it's a lot easier to get that grease gun in at an angle coming in this way. You do have ample room when the wheel's on and everything to be able to get your grease gun on the zerks coming into the top. But through this, it would basically have to put you in here, and it just gives you a greater possibility of getting grease on your rotor, and you don't really want to do that because then you get grease on your brakes, and that's a bad situation. So that makes it a lot easier. You can grease each one of these, and with the 90-degree, it allows you to grease that whole assembly a lot easier and maintain it. I found that with I wasn't able to get to them well enough, and before I put the 90s in there, I tended to grease everything and not those two because it was so hard to get to. I tried a slide greaser on the end of my gun, and that was still hard to get it in there and hold it on and get it to grease properly. Because these are metric, it does make it a little bit harder to find the fittings like that to slide on there. So now when I torn it apart, my bottom of my suspension was a lot better grease, so that means I'm getting a lot better wear, and I'm not possibly wearing out my bushings as much. So that's pretty much all there is to it. And I hope you enjoy your sand reaper, and hopefully you'll maintain it. And it's better to do this maintenance than it is to do and replace these expensive parts. So just giving you a little tutorial on how to tear the whole system apart.